Hello and welcome to the Clean Energy Pod powered by SSE, your guide to the people and technologies delivering the clean energy transition. On this edition, we hear from Musat from Renewables UK. It's the trade body that's helped deliver one of the biggest renewable energy markets anywhere in the world here in the United Kingdom. We'll learn the lessons from what's gone right, but also what needs to happen to maintain the country's success. Let's get started. Anna, first of all, before we kick off, just tell us a little bit about Renewables UK. What is the organisation? What's its purpose and what are the main challenges you're dealing with at the moment?
Sure. So Renewable UK is the trade association representing renewable energy developers and the supply chain. We cover all the key renewable technologies. A lot of our members are in offshore wind, but we also have a significant membership in onshore wind, green hydrogen, flexibility, long duration storage. So basically all the technologies that are needed to ensure that the future energy system works. And I've mentioned the supply chain as well. That's also one of our big areas of focus because it's not just about installing the infrastructure, but it's also about ensuring that we have the right ecosystem in place to manufacture things here in the UK, to provide the services, and to also do the innovation. So we have nearly 500 members right across all these different technologies that I mentioned. And for us, one of the key missions is obviously to get to that decarbonized power system and the future energy system in line with our goals. One of the key things that we're focused on now is obviously the general election, which is coming up quite soon. But I think in addition to that, there's also quite a lot of work ongoing to ensure that we can deploy in line with our pipeline, that we get the right people into the sector. Obviously, skills is a key challenge, which I'm sure we'll talk about later on. And also that we get the right infrastructure in place. But I think on top of all of that, and because I've mentioned the general election, it's also persuading politicians to ensure that we have the means to do that and that we can do it quickly and cost effectively.
And actually, from a UK perspective, it feels like the story is actually quite positive. Clearly, there's a general election going on. There's lots of stuff happening in the world. But actually, whichever party you listen to, they do talk quite a lot about what's been done so far in the UK and the opportunity to do even more. So are you really worried, or is it a matter of just keeping that consensus that's helped develop the industry in the last decade or so?
Yeah, so I think because I'm in a policy role, sometimes it's easy to get pessimistic because you look at very detailed stuff. But actually, if you take a bit of perspective, I would agree. I think we're in a pretty good place. And for me, one of the tests was obviously last year we had that unsuccessful auction for offshore wind that everybody talked about. But actually, it's really interesting to see that the market bounced back pretty quickly. And even if we did have that unsuccessful auction, we now, for this year's auction, have about 10 gigawatts in the pipeline. We have a lot of interest from investors and all the key developers to continue putting their money in the UK market. So I think there's a lot of activity that's going on. And in terms of the pipeline, again, it's quite significant. One of them, 68% of the capacity that was commissioned in 2023 around the world was actually in the UK and China. So again, it just really gives you a sense of the scale of our market. I think there's a lot of causes for optimism. As you've mentioned, there is a degree of cross-party consensus, which actually can't be taken for granted in many other countries. And I think, yes, even now there's a bit of an attempt to draw the political battle line somewhere. But it was really interesting at last year's party conferences, both parties were talking about the need to build a grid and enable us to make use of that clean power that we're installing. So, I think that's really positive. And I think everyone's pre-aligned in terms of, yes, we want to install renewables in time, recognize the fact that they can provide energy security and create a lot of other economic opportunities. And I also should say that the public support is also quite significant. And it's maybe not portrayed in that way sometimes if you look at the news, but actually about 88% of people support renewable energy, and about 74% of them also recognize that it brings economic benefits. So I think actually the public understanding is pretty much there. It's just about continuing to take them with us on the journey. In terms of, again, things that maybe worry me a bit, obviously you're always going to be worried about a general election and what comes after that. There's also that period pre-election where you're not going to get major policy development. So I think, yes, there is going to be a bit of a lag at the end of this year, but I'm really confident that whoever comes next still has that very clear understanding that the renewable sector is one that we should invest in. It's one that we're really good at, and we're known around the world for it. But it's just about how we ensure we don't lose a lot of time and we don't delay essential reforms.
If I'm hearing or seeing this recording though from outside the UK, just explain to people why the UK is a global leader in renewables, because the country's a major economy, but it's not the world's biggest country. It's not the United States. It's not in the EU anymore. Why has the UK got this strong renewables industry? Is it just the benefits of where it is in the world, or is there something else?
I think it's, yes, the weather resources are something that we do have. Obviously, it's really windy here, as we can see. And we've got a lot of coastline and a lot of seabed that we can use to deploy offshore wind, floating offshore wind in particular. But I think it's also a question of political leadership. And again, going back to that cross-party consensus, I think when we started deploying renewables in earnest, again, we had the buy-in from the Conservatives, from the Liberal Democrats, about the fact that, yes, this is a technology that is expensive now, but we know it's going to come down in cost, and we know that policy and government intervention has a role there. Now, that's not necessarily about subsidizing renewables to death, and obviously that hasn't happened in the traditional sense, but it's about giving certainty to people who come and invest in this market that you will be, to a certain degree, insulated from volatility, and that you can expect to get a fairly stable revenue. And that's actually what's happened with our Contracts for Difference scheme, which I think is one of the main planks of our success story when it comes to renewables. That's been put in place to effectively provide that revenue certainty that I mentioned, and ensure that if prices are really high, developers pay some of the money back to the Treasury. But if prices dip really low, then again, you get a bit of a top up on that. So that's been a really huge drive for incentivizing investment. And I think we've actually seen the cost going down over time, and we've seen economies of scale being reached, and just a really huge appetite for investment from different parts of the world. And it's really interesting. Something I really like about this job is the fact that we always get trade delegations from other countries and people from, South Korea, Japan, Belgium, coming to the UK to say, okay, we know about your Contracts for Difference scheme. We think it's really good. We kind of want to replicate that, but can you help us adapt it to our market conditions? So again, it just really shows that it is a thing like that, which can seem a bit technocratic maybe, but it's so useful, and other countries are replicating it. And again, I think we need to really take pride in that, because we've been one of the first countries to implement that, to really assume that, yes, this is a technology that will deliver for the UK. And I think what's been really important, again, is just having that long-term stability, because that's been introduced a while ago. But again, we haven't seen for each electoral cycle a desire to revisit or maybe change tack a little bit, because actually that's what's really damaging to investor confidence. So the fact that we've had that policy in place on an enduring basis has been really, really helpful. And you always get that clustering effect, right? I think once people start investing, you always get a few more, and then it just becomes this really thriving ecosystem, which I think is what we've seen here.
So it is legitimate then to say the UK is a global leader in this?
Yes, I think we are a global leader. We've been the first movers in many of these technologies. I think in some we can go a bit faster than we are to date, and green hydrogen is an example which maybe we can touch on. But I think in terms of the wind farms that we have, and especially offshore wind, we have some of the biggest ones in the world. And I think just the scale that we're operating at and the pace of deployment is quite astonishing to other countries. Again, I think we can't rest on our laurels, because when we started doing this, we were maybe the only game in town, at least when it came to Europe. Things are changing now, and obviously we have the Inflation Reduction Act from the US, we have the Net Zero Industry Act and the Wind Power Package from the EU. And what those packages do is effectively provide incentives to invest in renewables in those geographies, to attract the manufacturing and supply chain capability, and get the investment over there. So again, we can't just say, well, we've got the Contracts for Difference scheme, it's going to carry on as normal. We are a robust market, and we're going to keep getting some investment, but we also need to be alive to some of the changes in the market and respond to that.
But we are being chased. It is a race now, because you talked about repower in the EU. They're adopting, could well adopt the CFD, two-way CFD scheme that's been so successful. We see the Inflation Reduction Act in the US ramping up. the supply chains that have supported the UK's development of renewables. These are global supply chains, and so there is now competition for those resources. Renewables UK has recently published some research on UK supply chains. What does that say, and what needs to happen in order for the UK to maintain its lead?
Sure. So actually, I think the work that we've done on the supply chain is very timely, because we're asking exactly those questions. At a time of international competition, what can we most usefully do here, and what is feasible for us to do? So this work is called the Industrial Growth Plan, which we've worked with the Offshore Wind Industry Council, Crown Estate and Crown Estate Scotland, to deliver what is effectively the UK's unique value proposition in terms of the offshore wind supply chain. And what we're saying is, okay, we need to be pragmatic about this. We're not going to have the whole supply chain here in the UK, but there are some areas that we're really good at. Let's make sure that we build on those and capture that market share. And there are some areas where, yes, we might get some investment, but effectively we're not going to be the global leader in those. So maybe we rely more on imports, or we put in place the right trade arrangements to ensure that we don't have significant bottlenecks. And actually, that industrial growth plan is the deepest dive that has been done to date in our capabilities in offshore wind, and looking at where it makes sense for us to focus our efforts. Some of the key areas that we've identified where the UK could generally be a global market leader in terms of supply chain for offshore wind are blades. And let's remember, again, this is an area where we already have some investment in the hull and in the Isle of Wight, so we're not starting from scratch. Cables is another one, electrical system. And actually, the industrial growth plan also talks a lot about services. I think this maybe gets lost sometimes a bit in the supply chain discussions, especially if you look at the Inflation Reduction Act or what's happening in the EU. Everyone's really focused on reshoring manufacturing and bringing back manufacturing within their geographies. And I think that's valid. We absolutely need to do that. But I think let's not lose track of the fact that in the UK, services is one of our really strong points. So financial services, legal services, environmental services, all of those are really essential in propelling the sector forward. And it's something that we're really known for. Again, our financial sector is world leading. We're seen as a global hub for financial services. So it's something that we can build on. And I think that's effectively what the industrial growth plan is trying to do, is say, okay, whatever government comes in place next year, there's going to be limited money available. What does it make most sense for us to focus on, and where can we deploy that money to get the most bang for our buck? And what we've seen is actually the economic analysis is pretty robust. We could pretty much triple the supply chain capability by the 2030s if we implement that industrial growth plan. A lot of the money that is invested is going to be private money. And actually, for every pound that is invested in the economy, we get about nine pounds back as UK PLC, which is a pretty good deal, actually. So it makes a lot of economic sense to do it.
Let's talk about jobs, though, because one of the criticisms has been that you've had this massive expansion of renewables in the UK, but perhaps because of that, some of the supply chain issues, it hasn't translated into the very large numbers of jobs that perhaps people thought it might do when the industry was initially kicking off. When you look at your growth plan, what does it say about actual good green jobs here in the UK?
Yeah, so I think jobs are very much part of that deal. And again, I think whatever government takes us forward, that's the first question they ask us, right? It's how many jobs are there going to be created, and where can we expect those to be located? I think if we look at offshore wind, we've already created quite a lot of jobs. I think we have about 27,000, and we could create more by 2030. And actually, a lot of those jobs are very regionally dispersed. We've created jobs in coastal communities, which has helped regenerate those communities. And we've also created jobs in big urban centres such as London and Manchester and others. So I think the jobs are there. They're maybe not as visible sometimes. And I think one of the pinch points is always, when you talk about a green job, what exactly do you mean? Because, of course, not all the jobs will be people in hard hats installing the wind turbines or going out to sea. But some of the jobs are also in that services sector that I mentioned before. It's about getting the contracts right, getting the insurance in place. So again, the sector has a much bigger ecosystem and job footprint behind it than is maybe sometimes recognized. But again, I think it's just about being smart about where we invest, where we put our money. And if we do this in a targeted way and sustain it over time, we can create way more jobs. One of the challenges that we see from a lot of members is there's a lot of upskilling that needs to happen. Even if people graduate with an engineering degree, first of all, you need to raise awareness of the sector so they know that they can come in and apply their skills here. There might also be a degree of reskilling, training for health and safety. So, all of that requires quite a lot of effort. And we already see developers doing it in the local communities where they operate. But I think to be able to do that on a bigger scale, you need to have certainty of your future pipeline. You need to know that we're going to be deploying really large volumes year on year, and this is a market that we're staying in. And I think obviously that's the hope for everyone. It's just about how we create that political policy certainty over the long term.
We talk about renewables in the UK, but largely that conversation is offshore wind. There's obviously other forms of renewable energy that are generated here in the UK, onshore wind being one of them. And we do have this kind of weird experiment in the UK where you have certain parts of the UK, Scotland for instance. I mean, if you drive between Scotland and England, it's very, very obvious very quickly that Scotland largely has embraced onshore wind and England less so. Do you think that we're going to be in a position where onshore wind in England now becomes revitalised, having been largely on hold for a long period of time?
I mean, we certainly hope so, and it's one of our key aims for the next Parliament. We still have a de facto ban on onshore wind in England, and we have all these planning constraints that basically prevent developers from deploying, even when communities might want to see that deployment. So, for example, right now you need to, if you're an onshore wind developer in England, you need to rely on local planning authorities to designate an area where you can build. We know that those planning authorities are quite stretched and don't necessarily have the skills and resources to put together these energy plans. So that becomes quite challenging. And the other part is about how we deal with the community engagement and any community objections that might arise. The guidance is very unclear right now because it sets a fairly impossible standard that no other infrastructure has to meet. You effectively have to show that you've met every objection and you've responded to that in a reasonable way, which, in principle it sounds fine, but actually if you think about that as a legal standard, it's quite difficult to meet. And if we look at other types of infrastructure, like even waste incinerators, they don't have to meet that sort of threshold. So I think it kind of flies in the face of what people might want, because we've been doing a lot of work working with opinion polling to look at what people think about onshore wind infrastructure in their area. And especially at the time of the energy crisis when gas prices were so high, a lot of people would have wanted to see that infrastructure deployed more quickly. And because of those constraining rules, it is really difficult to do so. But actually, we've seen in other parts of England, it is possible to deploy it, and communities really want it. One of our members, Ripple Energy, has this community ownership scheme where you effectively buy a slice of a wind turbine, which is the size of a credit card, and that gives you discount on bills. But again, it shows that there are really clever ways to do community ownership, to get the community on board. And usually we find that communities are quite supportive if the impact of the infrastructure is well explained to them, if the engagement happens in a timely way, and if they can benefit from the infrastructure in some manner. And that's not something that developers aren't already doing, but it's just that legal and regulatory hurdle, which is set a bit too high. So we're certainly hoping that that's going to change, because it's our cheapest form of generation and it's quicker to build than offshore wind. It really doesn't make sense that we're not making more use of it.
And one of the other great technology hopes is that the UK's position is being able to generate so much green energy can then allow it to build up green hydrogen, for instance, a whole industry around that. Just explain where we are on that and what the potential is for the UK.
Yeah, so again, green hydrogen is one of those key technologies that we're focused on. We see that it has a really important role in integrating renewables in the future power system. It can also act as storage and soak up that excess generation when we have really windy days, and discharge it when needed. But actually it has really important applications in sectors that are trying to decarbonize but might find it harder to electrify. So one of the key applications that other sectors are looking at is in steel making, especially if you're talking about primary steel. There is a lot of demand for green hydrogen there. The question right now is, can we produce it at scale? Can we produce it economically? And can we get it to the places that might need it? And I think the answer to all those questions right now is maybe. Again, it's not necessarily that it's not possible from a technical perspective. It's more of a political and policy question. So again, that's one of those areas where it's worth reflecting on what's happening in the US, because we've been talking a lot about how we get a route to market for green hydrogen projects and how do we create business models that enable those conditions to happen for green hydrogen, like we've seen for offshore wind, where you get that de-risking, you get the economies of scale and costs come down. We have a business model now. It is very complicated. I'm not going to attempt to describe it because it will take the rest of this podcast. But if we compare it to what's happening in the US, they've come up with a really simple solution where they just give production tax credits to green hydrogen producers. I think it's about $4 per ton. But again, I think that stream of revenue is very clear. It's easy to access. Even if you don't have a lot of experience developing in the US market, you pretty much know what you need to do. So it's a really big point of attraction. Whereas I think for us in the UK, we've started the conversation on hydrogen earlier. There was some political buy-in, but I think we've delayed this business model so much that it's now become very complicated. And we actually talked to different developers who are not quite sure exactly what kind of support they qualify for. So the route to market is a bit muddled, basically. And in addition to that, we also need to build a transmission and storage network to get the hydrogen from where it's produced to where it's needed, especially some of those industrial sites that I mentioned. And again, it's not clear who pays for that and how we're going to do it. So this is not something that's news to government. We've certainly talked a lot about it and others have as well. But it's about just getting that urgency, because this is a really new market. It's going to be a huge global market, and it makes sense for us to be one of the leaders in it.
One of the other technologies that we at SEC talk about clearly is hydro, given some of our heritage. Do you see that resurgence? We see quite a few projects wanting to develop, including projects that haven't been of a scale that haven't been seen in decades. Do you see that playing a material role in terms of renewables generation, and how do we enable these projects to actually happen?
Absolutely. I think it's hydro, but actually just the wider question of how do we create long duration storage and how we bring it online quicker is a really key one, because obviously renewables are intermittent, we all know that, and to ensure that a renewables-based system works, we need to bring online storage just as quickly. And I think we're now coming to a point where we've deployed a lot and we need to make sure that storage capacity really catches up. Again, it's a question about route to market and how those projects are de-risked. There was a really interesting report that came out from Parliament the other week, and I think the title was long duration storage, like just get on with it, which I thought was a pretty sassy title for a parliamentary report. But I think it really reflects the mood of the industry. It's like we've talked about this a lot. Some of these technologies that do long duration storage are quite novel, but a lot of them are very established, like hydro. We know how to do this. Norway does it. So there's no reason why we couldn't. But it's about how you de-risk that investment. It's about what sort of revenue stream can developers expect. And I think if that's not clear, then the investment's not going to flow. I think actually a lot of the questions in terms of how we build the future energy system are about, are the routes to market clear? Because the capital is there, there's so much money that wants to be invested in this sector, but it's about whether we block it or unblock it. And I think, for me, long duration storage, that's the key thing. Just get the business models out and then we'll take it from there.
Let's skip forward 5 or 10 years. And how do you see the energy system having changed?
Yeah, I think that's a really timely question, especially because we're in the middle of this review of electricity market arrangements consultation, which is effectively looking at how the market should evolve to support our future energy system. I think, in 5 or 10 years, I hope that the market wouldn't have changed radically and overnight, because that's always a bit of a scary prospect for investors. And let's remember, it's not just the developers, but we also have a lot of money coming in from pension funds, from asset managers, and we need to ensure that the risk profile doesn't change substantially from one year to another, because that really shrinks your pool of investors and you're left with less private money to deliver the transition. But I think there are certain things that we need to look at. I think one of the key things that I hope to see in probably less than 5 years, is just having a clear route to market for some of those other technologies. And I think it's also about having that better whole system view, because right now we set a lot of technology specific targets, which is great. I think it's mobilized a lot of investment, and it's also really important for giving that clarity to the supply chain. But I think actually we need to slightly move beyond that and look at, okay, we're building 50 gigawatts of offshore wind, say we're building 30 gigawatts of onshore wind. How are those going to come together into the future system? And again, I think this long duration storage, the question of how we build more flexibility into the system is going to be really key, because otherwise we're just going to end up with a pretty large and expensive system. So I think we need to start asking those questions now, because we need to start deploying much more than we have to date. And then, I hope in 5 or 10 years, we're not going to have as many discussions about grid as we have today. Somehow we've managed not to mention grid yet, which is refreshing. But, I guess it's fair to say that there's so much infrastructure that we haven't been building as soon as we should have. We've built so many renewables, but the grid capacity isn't there to transport them effectively around the country. We're building much bigger blades, but we don't have the large enough ports to be able to ship them to the right places. And again, I think it's just one of those points of market failure where by the time you have clarity of demand, it's almost too late to make the investment. So I will hope that certainly in the next parliament, there's a more serious discussion about how we can align those investment cycles better and how we can get that infrastructure in place in a timely way.
Anna, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Before we go, one very quick request. We're all learning in this industry as we go along, and the more we can share knowledge, the faster we will deliver the clean energy transition. With that in mind, if you found value in this conversation, please give us a like, subscribe, or give us a comment below. Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.